O.G. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about belonging again, section 45. We have gone through character, community, ethics, discovered meaning, created meaning, the advantages, disadvantages of both, and this problem of needing something transcendent and authoritative over ourselves and our societies to help us avoid a lack of direction, being overwhelmed by existential tension, but then of course the risk of a transcendent order is the mass of Nazism, the banality of evil, and things like that. And we have explored and orbited questions of the children of Nietzsche, which is overlaid with absolute knowing, mentions of Jesus, say in Dostoevsky, Deleuzian individuals, and the like. Belief in capital X, and that's what we've been doing to refer to this transcendent order versus a lowercase x. Belief in capital X versus lowercase x dramatically impacts how a person lives, but perhaps our belief in the transcendent is a result of evolution, and perhaps ethics is an emergent phenomenon, but perhaps our belief in God today is thanks to forces that God didn't create. Perhaps religion and morality emergently arose alongside one another precisely to reinforce one another, seen as ethics backed by the transcendent versus the finite is more robust for the majority, has more authority over people, and is more likely to unify and hold people together. And I think in this audio recording I'll say transcendent versus finite. I think it will be clumsy to say capital X, lowercase x, but I try to use those symbols in the book to avoid the connotations like terms like transcendent, finite, infinite, and all of that has, or God, or so on and so forth. Anyway, to resume. If this is the case, if the transcendent is ultimately just a finitude that seems like a transcendent due to social evolution, then our awareness of how evolution gave rise to ethics and religion might be precisely what has ruined the ability of ethics and religion to have power and authority over us. Awareness about the nature of X may have taken away from us the possibility of ascribing to an X, and if we require X for community and characters and ethics, freedom and the like, then with awareness of the origins of civilization may come the inability of civilization to stay together. And by X there I meant the capital transcendence. And this act of self-awareness, of learning that all of this is a product of a social evolution of a kind, it could be as profound of a development on the subject as the gaining of measurement according to Hegel in the science of logic. And of course, once we know the truth, it might be too late to unknow it. Once we know the transcendent is actually and always been a finitude, the transcendent might be forever lost. Like one of those pictures hidden in a picture that the finder cannot unsee once it has been seen, to allude to Nabokov. But we couldn't have known this until we became so aware. Is consciousness a joke? If atheists are correct and there is no transcendent, if every transcendent is actually just an immanence, then there is actually no real difference between a created CCE and a discovered one. The difference is ultimately illusionary and merely a matter of awareness of what was always already, and it would follow that if CCE benefited us, humans may benefit from illusions. Believing wrongly that the transcendent isn't finite could result in practical benefits, lost when we know the truth, and it seems possibly the case that without the illusion, it isn't probable that the CCE will be sustained or avoid devolving into mere values, as Dr. Hunter discusses for the majority. However, there might be reason to hope. If the transcendent was ultimately, created by us, there's reason to believe it's possible for us to create another transcendent that we genuinely believe is a transcendent versus a immanence or something finite, though those who do the creating might have to practically forget what they have done for it to work on them and never tell anyone else the truth. The very fact that character has existed in the past when the transcendent has always actually been finite is evidence that character is possible even without an actual transcendence. The question, though, is whether or not character is possible when we are aware that the transcendent is actually finite. Furthermore, the notion of the transcendent may have emerged evolutionarily, which is to say no one ever really consciously created the transcendent. Such an act seems new. And of course, all of that was assuming the worldview of the atheist, as we spoke, on the idea of the transcendent actually having substance would be outside the scope of this work. So character might be possible without the transcendent. If institutions today had authority, if people believed in the authority of the American government, for example, and believed in its projects, even if they required self-denial from the American people. But as Habermas has written on, institutions are suffering a legitimization crisis. So this does not seem to be an option. And the very fact a legitimization crisis has occurred is perhaps evidence that the finite cannot ultimately sustain CCE, that a transcendent is needed, even if one that is actually a finite, something finite without us realizing it. Without authorities over us, rather God or institutions are only self-imposed restrictions and acts of self-denial, which are hence expressions of the will and so proof of the triumph of the therapeutic, threatening the power of and meaningfulness of CCE. Are we stuck? Paradoxically, without CCE ascribing to and supporting a transcendence or authority, it is very difficult for a person to believe that a CCE isn't arbitrary and ultimately self-imposed. When the CCE is lost, it is remarkably difficult and perhaps impossible to restore. It's like restoring a given, which, that quote from Wittgenstein we use in the book on restoring tradition is like restoring a spider web with your bare hands. Very useful quote from Wittgenstein. So with the transcendent, it takes with it its plausibility, and it takes from the finite its sense of permanency, changing everything. As a result, the CC feels more finite than authoritative and transcendent, and that's a problem. So CCE seems to work best when people just find themselves in the middle of it, thrown, as Heidegger would put it, as if the CCE has always been there and always would be, non-contingently, transcendently, basically. Its power is weaker both when it ascends and declines. So when we begin to realize we need to either build a new CCE or the CCE is in decline, in both states, the contingency and temporality of the CCE is more difficult to overlook. So the more like the transcendent the CCE feels, the more it provides a sense of robustness and legitimacy to the individual choices of those within it. And when those individuals deny themselves, the act feels more definable from self-expression and self-will. When one is baptized, for example, the CCE provides a robustness and legitimacy to the choice that makes those being baptized feel more confident that what they're doing isn't merely a personal preference, but conforming and self-denial into a transcendent order. Participants more so feel they are laying down their lives for something bigger than themselves, a CCE which may incarnate a transcendent into the world and point to that transcendence, its life source. Could all this be mass brainwashing? Of course it could be. If there is a transcendent in a society, there will be this tragic possibility. And so we must weigh the costs and benefits. And the very fact we could wonder this is evidence itself that the power of CCEs to plausibly define in our mind self-expression from self-denial has greatly diminished. Today, if that definability isn't entirely gone, CCE and acts are so marred by a sense of the therapeutic, by the possibility that it is all ultimately self-imposed and arbitrary, that neither is likely to compel people like they did when more given. Perhaps this is why the rise of pluralism, with the rise of pluralism, Christianity becomes more like Christendom, as Kierkegaard feared. A role of CCE and culture is to help individuals feel as if their self-imposed ideas about the nature of reality and the communities that formulate around those ideas aren't illusions or deceptive, even if they are, palatable and worth lifelong dedication. Theoretically, if a CCE without a transcendence could achieve this state, CCE would be possible and sustainable, though admittedly this seems as difficult to me as restoring givens. What is sought seems to be a kind of self-forgetfulness, as opposed to selflessness or selflessness, or CCE self-forgetfulness. And as Timothy Keller argued, self-forgetfulness is an important dimension of character. And I think, although this idea could apply to anyone while discussing Christian character, Keller wrote in The Freedom of Self-Forgetfulness, and I think this is a very important idea. The truly gospel humble person is a self-forgetful person whose ego is just like his or her toes. It just works. It does not draw attention to itself. The toes just work. The ego just works. Neither draws attention to itself. I think this notion applies just as well to community character and ethics. They work best when we don't think about them working, but use them all the same. But as has already been discussed, once a given CCE feels contested and the plausibility or the possibility is realized that the CCE's transcendence could ultimately be finite, it might be impossible to forget what is known. Like a hidden picture we cannot unsee once it has been seen, to allude to Nabokov again. Speak memory. Under these pressures, self-forgetfulness seems much more difficult to achieve, and furthermore, without a community to support the act or a transcendent for the self to be lost in, acts of self-forgetfulness will easily be indistinguishable from acts of self-expression, and difficult for the one engaging in self-forgetfulness to not know that what he or she is doing is an act of individual will, versus, say, an act of humility before and toward God or a community. If there is no transcendent or authoritative community to forget ourselves in, then we can only forget ourselves in ourselves, which is an act of self-acknowledgement. In this context, self-forgetfulness seems impossible to meaningfully define from methods of building self-esteem, from some other practice of self-help that will help individuals be who they want to be and do what they want to do. Personally, I am very attracted to the idea of self-forgetfulness, but it also seems as if self-forgetfulness is no guarantee of addressing our overarching concerns. For I can be self-forgetful in a massive Nazism, and arguably self-forgetfulness is precisely a step toward the thoughtlessness which makes possible the banality of evil. Furthermore, if I am self-forgetful in the actions toward a finitude, isn't that just brainwashing? Self-forgetfulness might also not be possible without a transcendence, just temporary moments of flow, for there was no God to be daily lost in and toward. But what if it was possible for us to create a transcendence that was practically believed was a discovered transcendence, thus making self-forgetfulness possible again while at the same time avoiding atomization? Such a creation would require a Nietzschean child. But in that situation, only the child would gain a created discovered transcendence, not the majority. So it would be a creative like discovered capital X, which would function as a transcendence even though its origin would be finite. So it would be created yet discovered. It would be practically discovered even though it was created. And that seems to be what Nietzsche is really big on. And that's where Matthew Stanley, he was emphasizing the notion of promise in Nietzsche, which I found a really, really interesting idea. To resume, well, could the child use influence, and this is the question leading into the next section. So we don't deny the possibility of a minority of people being a Nietzschean child and thus creating a value for themselves that functioned practically like a discovered one. But could that child use influence or charisma to bind together the majority toward the created discovered X? If a Nietzschean child were to create such a value and then charismatically motivate the majority to live according to that created transcendence, which is paradoxical but intentionally so, would we address the concerns of belonging again of this book? Perhaps. For the rest of the playlist on belonging again, please see it at YouTube. Please visit ogrose.com and please see the list of the sections on Medium. And thank you so much for your time.